Hello, everyone, and welcome to a combined lecture 9 and 10 on the classical era. So we'll be doing the two lecture videos actually in one for this for this week. So talk a little bit about some of the transitions. So we're moving out of the Baroque era into a new way of thinking, of being, of composing, and with that comes certain mindsets and frameworks and maybe ways that things should be approached. And you'll see that as we move through the different eras of music. So we've seen it as we moved from music of antiquity into the Renaissance, from the Renaissance into the Baroque era, and now we'll see it as we move into the classical era, and then as we move into the Romantic era of the 19th century, and then into the 20th century through to the present day. So a large part of this has to do with some of the ways in which composers are altering their way of looking at music. So as the slide shows, composers utilizing maybe a more melodramatic style of composition. Johann Sebastian Bach's sons, Johann Christoph Bach and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, they were some of the more well-known composers of this type of music. Lesser known as shown on the slide, but later on they become like some of the main names that get associated with kind of the early classical music period. Now, later on, as we push into the classical era, you see names like Haydn, like Mozart, that come to the forefront, and with that comes a certain expectation as to how this music should sound, and maybe even one could go as far to say maybe how this music could function within life as a whole. It's interesting to note that we tend to think of this music as a little more on the kind of the high societal front, and true, a lot of this was played in high society functions. There's a lot of this music, though, that was played from the classical era that was played for played in the home, as well as played for religious function as well. So it wasn't just concert hall type music, if you will. One of the big hubs for all of this is Austria, and especially Vienna, as a lot of political and religious life will kind of focus around there. Now, some things to point out is that there's a little bit of kind of a tension between neighbors during this time. Austria is very much a Catholic state, a Catholic nation. And so their ideals and the music that a lot of composers are engaged in for congregational worship comes from a Roman Catholic framework. Germany has remained Protestant in the post-Reformation era. So now we're moving on classical era from about 1750 to about 1820-ish. So we are, almost over 200 years past the Protestant Reformation, and Germany remains very much Protestant this whole time. One of the interesting parts of this is that a lot of the sacred music composed during this time was actually composed for use in the Roman Catholic Church. And so you will see composers, whether they be Protestants or whether they be Roman Catholics, predominantly, again, during this time period, they will be composing forms of the ordinary of the Mass, which, again, composers have been doing literally for centuries, because they knew that there would always be a steady stream for that, a steady need for new settings of the Mass. And composers are still doing it today as well, whether you're talking people who are composing for orchestra, or whether you're talking about people who maybe lead more in like contemporary Christian music settings. You're finding, and a lot in between, you're finding people who are doing arrangements of that. Now, there are three types of masses that were typically used. You had the Missa Brevis. This would be your normal going to church Sunday mass that would get used. So this would be the one that you would hear, probably between like 50% to 2/3 of the time throughout the year. So it would have been the one that you were most familiar with. You had the high mass, which would be used on feast days. So with the high mass, the music would probably be a little bit more embellished because it's for a special occasion. And so we want the music to reflect the specialness and the grandeur of the occasion. So the music would be more up. The clergy would probably wear nicer robes. People might dress a little nicer as they're coming to service. The music will be more ornamented and so on, maybe a larger processional. And these would be, so feast days, so big days in the church calendar. So you have days like Christmas, like Easter, Pentecost, exaltation of the Holy Cross, certain patron saints or festivals honoring like events in the church calendar maybe, or events that are special to that particular parish or region. So for example, if there's a church in Hutchinson, not too far from where I'm at, that is called Holy Cross Catholic Church. So on September 14th, which is the Feast of the Holy Cross, they would do, if they were following this model, they would do a high mass because it's the name of their church. It's an important day for them. And so they honor that. Third type of mass would be a requiem mass. And this is the one that's typically used for funerals in the Roman Catholic tradition. And again, these are forms that people are continuing to compose into this day. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, people have taken some liberty, particularly with things like a requiem mass, and they haven't done it specifically according to the Roman rite or the Roman form of the mass. We can get into that, I suppose, in a later lecture. But the requiem, you're going to omit the Gloria and the Creed, and you insert the Dies Irae, or the chant the Day of Wrath, which again is a longer, I believe it's 19-verse hymn that's used to describe the Day of Judgment that all people must face, but ultimately those who believe in Christ, who have accepted him as Lord, will find their way to heaven as part of it. So Franz Joseph Haydn, who really, if you can boil the classical era, kind of the back half at least of the 18th century down to three composers, it would be Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And Haydn certainly takes priority, partially because he's the oldest and he was composing first, also because of how he was known and what his music was known for and the like. So he's known as the father of the symphony and the string quartet, and true to form, he composes several symphony arrangements, dozens and dozens of quartets. And we begin to see the string quartet being one of the standard forms for small chamber music. So before, it might have been kind of a mixed ensemble, if you will, of different musical instruments, whether it be like a recorder and a harpsichord or something like that. But Haydn takes the string quartet, so two violins, viola, and cello, and really makes that the standard for up to the present day, quite frankly. He sang, when he was younger, he sang as part of the Vienna Boys Choir, which is this internationally known, renowned ensemble for young boys, and still exists today. Matter of fact, they have visited Kansas on multiple occasions, I believe, including once recently here in the last few years. He was a Catholic. He was a Roman Catholic, and yet he was criticized a little bit due to the nature of his music. So there's long been a debate as to how do we present this music that's utilized in church, because it should be reverent. There's times maybe when it should be more sober, as it were, than others, more introspective and such. And so Haydn being chastised by his peers for the liveliness and enthusiasm of his music. And it's really kind of fascinating to think that even back in the 18th century, people are being chastised for how lively or upbeat their music is. It's not just a 20th and 21st century thing. This has been going on for quite a while, and you'll have that theme of redundancy throughout the years, throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, coming back time and time again. It's like, a lot of people have thought, oh, this is just an issue that we've dealt with in the 20th and 21st century, and so on. It's like, no, there are certain issues that that has been popping up time and time again for the church. And that idea of the liveliness and enthusiasm is one of those things. He did have to go and eventually stand before the Empress Maria Theresa to explain himself and defend his music. And this is what he's quoted as saying: "Since God has given me a cheerful heart, he will forgive me for serving him cheerfully." And it's kind of like, how can you argue with that? How can you, as a Christian, how can you say, I can't help but, it kind of boggles the mind at times as to, we proclaim this love and this joy and this peace, and then why should we be ashamed to express this love and joy and peace? Kind of catches me a little bit. And so Haydn was justified in his statement, in his compositions, and so we move on. Some of his larger and more well-known works, his Imperial Mass, which typically has the nickname of the Lord Nelson Mass, the Pauken Messa, and then his Creation. So each of these having some kind of an element of religious appeal or some kind of a religious emphasis. So the Pauken Messa, as you can see there, translating the kettle drum mass. So this one being described as a mass that could be utilized or that was composed in a time of war. And he used the mass then to kind of gird or underpin the fact that war was going on, or the idea of war going on, and framing music that would be appropriate for that time and that season. And as noted, he would do an annual mass for the Princess Maria Hermenegild's name day, which happened to fall on September 8th. So then every year he would compose a new arrangement of the Mass for the worship service that would go on to honor her name day. So that being the day after whom she was named, or the day that she received her Christian name. The Imperial Mass, a Mass for troubled times. So the reason behind this is you have Admiral Horatio Nelson, Lord Nelson. It was nicknamed as such due to Nelson's defeat of Napoleon. And you'll see some of these composers from time to time, they'll add just a little bit of a kind of commentary perhaps in the title of their pieces, because they're not in the classical era, they're just at the end will start to get a sense of programmatic music and naming their pieces after or giving them descriptive titles rather than just saying this is symphony number 1, symphony number 2, and so on and so forth. His creation, this is one of the pieces that Haydn's most well known for. And so you can see the 3 parts that it breaks into. So days 1 through 4, 5 and 6, and then day 7 or day 6, and then later on with Adam and Eve. Of course, on day 7 he rested. So those 3 basic parts making up the whole of the work. And if you get some time in the next week, just put it on. Just put on Haydn's creation and see if you can follow from Let There Be Light through to the creation of Adam and Eve. It's a delightful piece, and there's some wonderful parts in there that I won't go into right now, and I'll let you discover them on your own here. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, out of all the composers in history, there are very, very few that can be compared to Mozart in terms of the amount that he wrote, as well as to the legend that he became. And he's one of these figures who lived a rather short yet impactful life, and really it was because of him that we have a lot of the compositions that would come in the couple hundred years almost that have followed his death. So he was a child prodigy, both in terms of performance and composition. Both he and his older sister Nannerl were very gifted, both as performers and composers, Nannerl being a few years older. Their father, Leopold, was a musician and composer and teacher, music teacher in his own right, and he recognized the abilities of his children and decided to capitalize on that. And so he took his children touring around Europe, playing for aristocracy, royalty, church hierarchy, and from before he was even 7 years old, Mozart had performed for heads of state, had started to compose pieces of music and win the attention and affections of a lot of the nobility, and again, the aristocracy and the church from around continental Europe, and his fame began to spread very, very quickly. His family were devout Roman Catholics, and so as a result, we do see a sacred nature in a lot of his, or there are quite a few sacred pieces that he composes throughout, not the least of which is several mass settings. So he does have an oratorio on the penitence of David, of King David. His Mass in C major, his Missa Brevis. So again, we talked about the Missa Brevis earlier. Coronation Mass, which hopefully the title is self-explanatory. So Mass for coronation, or giving the illusion of coronation. So you can listen to it and think about somebody being crowned king or queen. And with a lot of the classical era masses, there's actually maybe a little bit of a divide as to their usage. So not all of them were practically able to be used during a Sunday morning mass. While Bach was writing cantatas back in the Baroque era that were like maybe 15 to 20 minutes long that could be used in the Sunday morning service, some of these mass settings could be 30 and 40 minutes long. And it was more difficult to drop a 40-minute long mass setting into part of the Sunday morning service. Now, keep in mind, if it's a Missa Brevis, as what's shown on the screen, then it would have the Agnus Dei and the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, the Kyrie, the Agnus Dei, excuse me, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Agnus Dei. It would have the 5 parts, and then those would be utilized as part of the Mass. However, if you think about it, and if between those 5 pieces, you would have 15 to 20 minutes of music, and then all of a sudden you double that, then it becomes a little more difficult to insert that into a Sunday morning worship service. And so a lot of the Mass settings by later classical and into the Romantic era composers would become concert Mass settings. They weren't intended for Sunday morning congregational worship services. Occasionally you'll find an excerpt, like maybe one of the movements will be used for a congregational worship service, but that's a little lesser known as it starts to go on, as people start composing more of the concertized Mass settings versus the Sunday morning ones. So as we prepare to move from the 18th century of classical music into the 20th century of Romantic era music, there's a few things to keep in mind. One is what's called the pendulum theory. So the pendulum theory, the idea that the era of music, the period of music that comes next, can be seen as like a response or a reaction to what came before it. And that's how you start to see kind of this shift back and forth between eras. And if you wrote the words antiquity, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic, and you skipped every other word, so that you went from antiquity to Baroque to Romantic and then Renaissance to classical, you'd actually find that those that you have connected would have a lot more in common than they do with the adjacent eras, in terms of, maybe at least in terms of ethos, mindset and theory, rather than specifically music, because there is quite a change between the Baroque era and the Romantic era. There's quite a difference between the Renaissance and the classical era, and yet there's still some things that hold consistent between them. So in the classical period, then you have, it is an age of objectivity, clarity. We see the Greek revival. We see clean lines. We see very methodical approaches to music and composition. One extreme is that somewhere, and you'll have to do a little bit of research, but there was a book that's attributed to Mozart that's basically a book of short musical excerpts that comes with a pair of dice that you could throw, and whatever number came up, you could flip to that page, play that piece, that excerpt, and then throw the dice again and flip to the page and play the next bit. So it was much more like building blocks, like Legos. We'd put like together 2 and 4 and 8 and 16 measure phrases and build a larger piece out of it. The Romantic era swings the pendulum in the other direction. So it's objectivity. It's what is my framework? What is my worldview? It's pushed into imagination, the era of imagination, and there's a lot of mystery involved. And we'll see that a little bit more as we go to the next week's lecture on the Romantic era. One way you can see this is through the use of the titles of pieces of music. So as you can see in the classical period one, sonata in B flat major. So that'd be considered more absolute music, perhaps. So it's kind of music for music's sake. The composer doesn't necessarily put their emotions and feelings and, doesn't write that necessarily into the piece. Whereas, say, a Faust Fantasia. So it's program music. If you know the legend of Faust, then it would make sense. A man who is who desires to continue his youth, makes a deal with the devil in order to do so. And you'd be able to hear elements of that then as you listen to the piece. So we mentioned Haydn, we mentioned Mozart, and that leaves us very briefly with Beethoven. So if I'm not sure of another person in music history who arguably single-handedly made the shift from one era of music into another, or facilitated the shift, other than Beethoven. So some of the pieces that he's probably most well known for, his third symphony, known as his Eroica Symphony, the fifth symphony, which often is described as Beethoven wrestling with fate, having now discovered the fact that he is going deaf and taking at least mental steps to work against that. And then, of course, his Ninth Symphony, which contains in the final movement a choir, first time that that's ever done, that a choir is featured in an orchestral symphony work, and has a lyrical text that is predominantly written by Hugo Schiller. Then there's his Moonlight Sonata for piano, his Waldstein Sonata. He also did a series of sacred works, his Missa Solemnis, so the solemn mass. He writes an oratorio, Christ on the Mount of Olives. So as Christ is towards the end, working towards the cross, so a meditation on that. And then finally his Mass in C major. So there's a lot of these kind of works that we start to see that get utilized, these forms of sacred music that are being utilized by composers that really start to change over the next century as we make our way into the Romantic era. So we'll see that transition as we move into the next video lecture. So until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. In Jesus' name, amen. We will see you next time.